Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Reviews. This is a series in which I give, as the title suggests, rather unvarnished and sometimes critical and straightforward, honest reviews of mostly recent works in practical philosophy, understood in a very broad sense. And the book that we have this time is pretty new, 2022. And it's by the author Carneades. This, of course, is a pseudonym. There's nobody out there actually named Carneades, as far as I know, since ancient times. Carneades was a very famous skeptic within Plato's Academy. And the book is called Are All Lives Equal? Why Cost-Benefit Analysis Values Rich Lives More, and How Philosophy Can Fix It. So this fits very, very much within the wheelhouse of practical philosophy. It's a place where philosophy, policy, and economics are coinciding. And I will say, before we jump into all of the meat of the review, that I think this is a pretty good book. It may be a little dry for some readers, as we'll talk about when we get to the problematic stuff at the very end, but it is a really solid volume, so I look forward to telling you all about this work. We always begin by talking about the three S's: style, structure, and summary. And so let me start with the summary this time. There is a proposition, you could say, that is running throughout the entire work. And, it's connected to the subtitle, Why Cost-Benefit Analysis Values Rich Lives More and How Philosophy Can Fix It. And there is a philosophy, fix it, being offered in this work after examining how cost-benefit analysis is supposed to work and some of the guiding assumptions behind it and who uses it and how they use it. And the author Carneades is going to be arguing a case that ultimately, if we want to have a more equitable, fair, ethical distribution of benefits and harms, which is what cost-benefit analysis can be a tool for helping us with, then we need to shift away from assessing all these matters, because they have to be quantitatively workable. We have to move away from absolute willingness to pay or all sorts of other assumptions and start thinking in terms of percentage willingness to pay. So what we would do with that is to begin valuing different people's lives depending on their social status or income or wealth. We would begin evaluating them on kind of a more level playing field. And that is really the central contention that is made throughout the entire work. So that's a summary of sorts. And I guess to add to the summary, you could say that this is a book of philosophy, applied philosophy, aiming at making that case by going through things systematically, methodically, trying to close any possible loopholes and address any reasonable concerns that might be brought up by various types of readers. And it's essentially a policy argument and an ethics argument. So that's the summary. As far as style goes, it's a very readable work. It's difficult to write popular philosophy without watering things down too much. And this book is actually succeeding in maintaining a lot of philosophical rigor, but also, writing in a way that is doing some justice to the material, but also presenting it for ordinary people who might be interested in it and specialists in other fields. Now, as far as the structure goes, it's divided into three main sections. After the beginning, Let Them Eat Toxic Waste, which is beginning by talking about Larry Summers and this argument that he was making about how we should essentially distribute toxic waste to the third world because their lives aren't as valuable. This is a Lawrence Summers memo from 1991. It then goes into three main sections titled How We Got Here. And that's a short one. It's got 2 chapters in it. And that's looking at some of the bases about cost-benefit analysis. And there's actually a chapter called How to Value a Life. Then the second section, Insufficient Responses, talking about why the predominant ways of understanding these matters and therefore engaging in policy arguments are not really capturing what needs to be captured, and there's 5 chapters there. And then the third part is much longer, percentage willingness to pay. It's making the case for this in a number of different ways. And that third section actually includes 2 chapters that are essentially extended case studies. Chapter 14, The Value of Black Lives, talking about risks involved with policing and the broken windows approach to communities and policing and allocation of resources, the various dangers that are associated with that. And then, very interestingly, and it shows you how contemporary a work this is, Chapter 15 is called COVID-19, Your Money or Your Life. And I mean, that's a very important topic to be considering in our world. This is a bit of a digression, not the only pandemic that we'll see in our lifetimes, unless, of course, we get killed by one of them. So, it's really well thought through, I would say. Another interesting feature of it, there is a list of thought experiments with indexed to the chapters. One of the features of this work is that there are a number of what are being billed as thought experiments. We'll talk about whether they are truly thought experiments or not a little bit later, but there's certainly good cases, good ways of illustrating what's going on in there. And there's several appendices that are also quite useful. One of the appendices has to do with Carneades. Well, actually, one of them does, and then there's an about the author at the end. So Appendix C is a note on skepticism. Carneades is, invoking a skeptical position. How is this rather, we could say dogmatic assertions about life and policy and things like that? How is that compatible with skepticism? And Carneades makes a good case for that. And then a lot of the other things are about how lives indeed are actually valued, and it's providing us with the information that we need to figure this stuff out and to be well informed about it. There's also an extended references section, which is very nice. It's a number of pages, and so if somebody wants to follow up and do more work on this, they can do so. And then there's an about the author. So I should actually mention this here, because I'm sure some people are kind of curious. They've heard me mention that this is a pseudonym. So Carneades, if you don't know, is somebody like me, the creator, producer of a lot of YouTube videos. And Carneades has been around, I think, about as long as my channel has, and is, roughly on a par, although Carneades is doing different kinds of videos than I'm doing, but they're covering a lot of similar ground, and they're very, well thought out and educational. So it says Carneades is the creator of the Educational Philosophy YouTube channel, carneades.org, as well as an international development practitioner with experience bringing philosophical analysis to bear on the myriad problems in global development. And I like this line. The channel was founded with the goal of repaving the agora with the rubble of the ivory tower, making philosophy and philosophical debate more accessible for a broader audience, and championing philosophical skepticism. So, very on point with that. So that's probably enough about the structure, style, and summary at this point. So what are the key or central ideas of this work? As mentioned earlier, the central thesis of this work is that if we want to value lives more or less equally without privileging or prioritizing rich lives within particular communities or globally prioritizing rich people in developed countries over everybody else in the world, then we need to think very carefully about how we do cost-benefit analysis. And, really good point that gets made in the work, well, why not just get away from cost-benefit analysis? We've got other ways of doing ethics. And I do want to mention something here. I teach business ethics, and one of the articles that I make sure to incorporate when we're going through the field is by Robert Audi, incredibly important ethicist of the 20th and 21st century. And he actually has a great article that makes the case why cost-benefit analysis isn't just for utilitarians or other consequentialists, but even virtue ethicists and deontologists, including Kantian deontologists. We really, shouldn't be careless in how we apply cost-benefit analysis, but we also should use it. And that's one of the cases that Carneades is making in here, that we're stuck with this tool. The economists and other people who get to advise people on policy, the policy makers, are using this as a tool. So what we want to do is find ways to improve the tool, improve the uses of the tool. And so, as mentioned, one of the central ways of doing that is to get away from what we call absolute willingness to pay, which is, you ask somebody, well, if you were going to lower the risk to, yourself by 1 in 1,000, the toxic waste dump is going to be built in your community, how much would you pay to not have that risk? Or how much would you pay for a benefit? Now, obviously, if you're rich and you don't have as many constraints, you've got a much greater not just willingness, but capacity to pay. And there's all sorts of other ramifications of this. Many poor people simply don't have the resources to do that. So what we should do, according to Carneades, and I think this is a very good case, is move away from absolute willingness to pay and move to percentage willingness to pay. How much of your income or resources, what percentage are you willing to give up in order to lower your risk or in order to gain some sort of benefit? And as he points out, when we look at things across the world, it turns out that things are fairly uniform among people. So if we do that, we're going to have a much more fair, just, equitable, however you want to frame it, a morally acceptable way of figuring these matters out, ranging from where to locate pollution to providing medical benefits to whether we should inoculate people, how much should vaccines cost, if anything. All sorts of issues can be handled in this way. And there is actually a really central problematic running here. How to determine matters in ways that are actually mapping onto our basic assumption that I think most people share. I mean, there are some people who clearly don't share this for various reasons, that, when we're making decisions that affect a lot of people, we should be fair. We should be ethical in doing so. Chapter 13, I think, is particularly interesting in this respect. It's actually titled "The Lie at the Heart of Economics," and Carneades is beginning by looking at some of the really key assumptions that are being made. So here's a little bit of what the text says. The concerns we have explored here represent more than a minor issue relegated to the valuation of life. The concern about absolute willingness to pay represents something much deeper. It is a failing at the heart of economics as a discipline to accurately measure welfare. This failing systematically prioritizes the needs of the wealthy over the needs of the poor. It is baked into the basic assumptions of economics that the needs of those who can pay more are worth more. Economics is not merely the dismal science, it is the immoral science, because it uses mathematics to hide a deeply biased and political assumption resting at its foundation that poor people don't matter, only rich people do. And so Carneades wants to, as a good philosopher, to uncover these assumptions, to question them, to bring them into the sunlight and say, this is not okay. He also points out, when it comes to philosophers, unlike many philosophers who would throw the economics department out with the bathwater, I think it can be reformed, although it may take some effort. And one of the points that he's making is that we cannot just say, as philosophers or as people who would, more broadly speaking, want to prioritize ethics, we can't just say, get rid of cost-benefit analysis. Just wing it or go by your gut, because we do need techniques for figuring these matters out. There's a good reason why cost-benefit analyses and all the assumptions that go along with them became one of the predominant ways of determining how resources and harms, benefits, and risks are in fact going to be distributed. So if we get rid of the tool altogether, that's not any good either, as Carneades points out. As a matter of fact, there's a good case that'll be even more arbitrary and less ethical in doing that. So I think that's a pretty good way to summarize some of the key ideas in the work as you're going to find it. And maybe we'll leave off there. There's a lot more that could be said about what you're going to find in this work, but I'll just mention that what is being constructed here is a complex argument that has a lot of moving parts, entails some what seem to be digressions, but everything is actually connected together within the work. And that's, really one of the good points. So we should move on next to the other things that I find valuable or good about this work. So what are the good points about this? I mean, to begin with, I think that this is very well thought through, structured, and researched. Again, I'll point towards the sources that, or the references that is, about 15 pages roughly in the back, so you can follow up your own work. I also think that the summaries that Carneades is providing of these sources is really quite good too. It's there's a lot of doing what a good philosopher does, which is to say, so here's what the source is saying, here's what I like about it, here's what I find problematic, why do I find it problematic, making all of those critical distinctions. That's very important. I think the book successfully makes its case, so it provides an argument, and it's a well worked out argument that ought to motivate us to want to do things differently. It's making the case that cost-benefit analyses are in fact needed, but they need to be improved, and the way that they're going to be improved ultimately is by having philosophers, and not just any philosophers, because a lot of philosophers would probably do a bad job with this, bringing philosophers into the discussion. I think it makes a great case for bringing applied philosophy into greater communication with policymaking and with economics on that point. Another thing that I do like about the book that comes out at several different points is when we're engaging in thinking about people's preferences and willingness to pay as something that we can measure. Carneades mentions that institutions and governments, strictly speaking, don't actually have preferences as such, although they play a massive role not just in making policy themselves, right, but also in communicating with each other about the policies that are going to be made or advocated or worked out, or whatever we're going to say. So that's a really critical point to bring up and to think through. I think that another really solid feature of the book is that, if you read this, it's ranging over a number of different theories, issues, approaches, assumptions in economics, in policy making, in ethics and moral philosophy, and doing a great job in not losing the thread of the argument. So anything that appears to be just a digression actually figures in here and fits in here in a way that's, in some respects, quite admirable. It's tough to write extended arguments well, and Carneades clearly has some talent for that. It's also good on, hitting on the problems with philosophers in particular, why it is that, so like he says, as ideological purists, philosophers have an inclination to propose solutions that may have negative practical implications but are justified in theory. Politicians, on the other hand, have a proclivity for solutions that are practically and politically viable, even when those solutions are not justified by the underlying theories. So figuring out how to connect these two together, that is really the difficult stuff, right? And if the politicians themselves are not going to do it, and the likelihood is that they're not, then philosophers need to be advocating for this, or people who understand philosophy need to be advocating for this in ways that are very pragmatic. Another thing that I think is particularly interesting about this work, and I would say is a good point, although in some respects it can also work against the book, is the myriad of, as the author is calling them, thought experiments, which are mostly about, this group over here prefers this to this degree, and they have this amount of resources or income. They're all fairly quantitative. If we want to call them thought experiments, I would actually just call them case studies or examples. And I think considered as case studies or examples, they do a lot of good work in moving the general argument forward and giving people ways of wrapping their heads around what's going on. I mean, you could chart them out on paper if you wanted to, and I think that could be quite helpful. So, the other thing that I'll say too is I think that Carneades has done a really good job in the writing of this, and it's, I would say, as clear and as interesting as this kind of material ought to be. I'll point one other thing out too. There are a number of kind of cool illustrations that you find throughout the work, and I myself like those. Some people might not like that sort of thing in what's essentially like a policy argument book, but I think these are pretty cool. So those are the things that I really like about the work. Is there anything that's problematic about the work? I mean, problematic is a better word than bad, because I don't have any criticisms as such about the work, but I do think that there are some things that might put certain readers off. I mean, to begin with, if you are the kind of person who's like, oh, I just don't understand math whatsoever. I mean, I would say in that case, you're probably lying to yourself, and you should like start, learning math, which you can do as an adult. But there's some people that are put off by quantitative analysis, and this book is full of quantitative analysis, in part because that's the topic. You're not going to get away from that. It is about cost-benefit, approaches to things which rely on quantification. So there's a lot of numbers in the work, and some readers might not get into that. And I think there's a lot of readers who might also find this a bit on the dry side, and that's unfortunate because I kind of gather that, as I said, I think the author made this as interesting as the material can be made while still writing for a general audience, not just a bunch of policy wonks or, philosophers. But there's only so much you can do with that. So is that problematic? Maybe. It depends on the kind of reader. There's nothing actually wrong with the book. It's just it's not going to appeal necessarily to everybody. I also think, calling the examples thought experiments is a little bit ambitious. It's like calling an 18 to 23 foot boat a ship when it's not really such. But that's kind of a quibble on my part. So I don't think that's really a big deal or something that should keep somebody from reading the work. And frankly, that's all that I have by way of mild criticism for the book. On the whole, I think it's quite good. So, final thoughts about this work. I think, having read through it, that this is actually a really good book. And I wish that we had a population and readership here in the United States that would eat this sort of stuff up, because I think it's making a really important case, and it's quite needed, and probably not just, of course, in the U.S., but throughout the world. So I recommend it. Then again, if you really, really don't like quantitative analysis, you might find it a bit off-putting and dry. But I think that, from an ethical perspective, this is actually making a really significant contribution. And I'd also say, and I'm going to say this by way of closing, this is doing public philosophy really well in a particular mode of doing public philosophy when it comes to the intersection between policymakers, including politicians and, important institutions, and economists and philosophers. This is really setting down a bunch of important challenges right at the heart of that. So I think it's quite a good book.